As someone that has spent a considerable amount of time on the various places of MBTI and invested over a dedicated decade of my large amounts of free time into it as my number one hobby, I have to say the following. First off, let me list some salient inaccuracies in your video. Unintentional or driven by my miscomprehension or not, I think they are vital to point out. Carl Jung's theory of personality type is driven by the predominance of one among the four primary types of qualia, as you point out. He does add later on that sensation and intuition are two opposite directions of one dimension, orthogonal to the similarly functioning feeling and thinking dimension, and that both of those simultaneously exhibit two modes, the introverted and the extroverted mode, leading to essentially three dimensions of personality, whereas in contrast to today's typology, a person that is high extroversion, high thinking, and high intuition will then have extroverted thinking paired with extroverted intuition as contrasted to pairing an extroverted thinking with strength. In the heteroverted domain of secondarily predominance, in this instance introverted intuition, the distinction of judging and perceiving is a failure and deviance from Carl Jung on the part of Myers and Briggs that failed to see personality as a three-dimensional space and instead decided to substitute dimensions for dichotomies, where upon realization they can distinguish the relative magnitude of two dichotomies as they are Boolean as opposed to vector-based, had to introduce a fourth dichotomy to distinguish amongst them. The further introductions of, for example, heteroverted domain of secondarily predominance, more commonly referred to as auxiliary function, has been a movement of a Christian school that was invoking some principles of balance in all things, though can be better summarized as necessity of expression of both within and outside of oneself, and proposes the secondarily heteroverted predominance takes the role of the within if the dominant mode of thought is outside and vice versa. Second of all, there is another error that you make which can be taken more explicitly, although not widely believed among the personality typology circles, and although it is for the most part false. Carl Jung actually did not think it was something static. I quote Dr. Jung. Well, you see, type is nothing static. It changes in the course of life. But I most certainly was characterized by thinking. I always thought from early childhood on, and I had a great deal of intuition too, and I had a definite difficulty with feeling, and my relation to reality was not particularly brilliant. I was often at variance with the reality of things. Now, that gives me all the necessary data for a diagnosis. Carl Jung, C.G. Jung, 1959, BBC interview. Third of all, in the second segment of your video, you make an error predominant within psychology that is perhaps the strongest crux of the whole ruckus, so to say, about MBTI and psychology, especially amongst the scientifically inclined but uninitiated. A vital flaw in today's psychology is its desperate need to appear scientific, such as to reclaim some of its authority. However, this attempt is vain and ultimately a fruitless endeavor. The only tools psychology as a science in this regard has at hand are statistical methods and data sufficiently parsable such as to apply those methods on. I need not tell you how ridiculous such a predicament is. For instance, as you mentioned with Big Five, a part of the video where you suspiciously omit the most important figure in psychology of Francis Galton, the actual means of deriving personality as envisioned by him and finally realized by Cattell, are founded in the ill method of asking the general populace to rate the overlap and similarity of personality adjectives, statements, etc., and through statistical analysis derive the deepest latent variables governing such ratings of similarities. While it may be a good, rough guess, this is in no way the rigorous science it preps itself up as, instead appearing closer to a more investigated form of democracy or interview of public opinion. We do not give our questionnaires asking the general populace what they think what happens on in the Hadron Collider. We do not give out people questionnaires asking facts of nature, such as the number of lobes within a rabbit's brain, their function and its geometry. We do not give out people questionnaires asking them anatomical questions of their very own human body, So how come, when suddenly we give out questionnaires to laymen, which busy their lives with making salaries and raising families, and at a near total or at least most lack of preoccupation with such questions, asking them the nature of the manifestation of the most complicated and mysteriously obscure machinery we've yet come across within our living proximity, their participation incentive and lazy-minded, time-constrained helpfulness, both leading to homogeneity in guesses, set up the paradigm of psychology as we know it today and strangles any hope as to an alternative. How come the opinions of lifelong psychologists whose origins lie in investigating the human culture invite breadth and cavernous depth, and who manages to tie some universalities therein to the experiences, thoughts, and hallucinations the patients he treats describe to him, all of it is merely thrown out as speculative gibberish, merely because it wasn't done in a sufficiently formal manner, in spite of the fact at the time, and I'd still wager today, in psychology, we're at an utter state of confusion of salience and interpretation, something that does not bond well with the restrictive net of Ben-Ferroni multiplied p-values and strict ethical boards, in spite of the fact all else we know of the human body we know, for the most part, by desecrating corpses, torturing our fellow humans, and observing tragedy and dysfunction. I understand the origin of such a motivation. Francis Galton's preoccupations with statistics and love for finding correlations in all things, especially the fellow human, has led him to interpret all he saw in this way, and luckily stumbled upon a similarly constructed factor of psychometric chi. However, a vital nuance between the two escaped the lineage of psychologists, statisticians, and thinkers since then. The vital difference between the latent variable of psychometric chi and that of the personality variables is that the prior is performative and the latter is interrogative. You will not get the opinions of humans within intelligence tests, because the factors there aren't direct. Instead, they sum up to a score of right and wrong answers, something beyond the test taker's interpretation, and then correlate those scores amongst each other to establish a difference of the test takers. That is to say, intelligence tests measure the test taker and as such qualify methodologically as valid. However, personality inquiries fail such a criterion as they ask from the position of test taker's interpretation, at worst, the semblance of adjectives, and at best, the perception of oneself, which, as is already known by the Dunning-Kruger effect, is quite ill misinformed and distorted broadly amongst nearly everyone taking the test, and they ask these directly, again, according to the test taker's interpretation, to disregard a clue of what the populace unifyingly thinks while supporting democracy and uplifting informal speculations of a superstitious German will be hypocritical. So I am not to dismiss the Big Five fully, though I must emphasize it must be taken more as a clue and less as a paradigmal dogma. Thirdly, and this comes in part from the second point I mentioned, the community and ideas revolving around psychological type resemble more that of speculative philosophy discussions and intellectual cafes, if I may be as bold, and holding 16 personalities as the site in any esteem is usually seen as a sign of the uninitiated. Neither the journal nor the center and not even the foundation are held in any esteem whatsoever by the vast majority of the community, and at best appear to attempt to represent and blow out of proportions a more founded persona within the scientific community, besides commercializing and conglomerating what is supposed to be a fringe niche interest, though admittedly a quite widespread one. Similarly, I hold psychology academics at very low esteem, and ironically no one doubts and questions the profession, which is far more broken than anything Carl Jung or MBTI enthusiasts have ever done, and they even draw heavily on the psychoanalytics. There are two psychology professions, one which may not prescribe drugs, commonly referred to as either therapists or psychologists, and one which may prescribe drugs, commonly referred to as psychiatrists. The therapists are quite easily a dumbed down version of psychoanalysis. My response to the mostly illegitimate practices and hypocrisy of the psychiatrists lies with the problems of especially the North American system of healthcare. Your doctors are not tasked with maintaining you in good health. They are tasked with maintaining you alive, and all their interventions, prescriptions, and other forms of treatment revolve around this task, whilst dealing with several day-long shifts and several other life-threatened patients on the line. In the USA, this system furthermore more takes on an even darker, more entrepreneurial twist, where they desire to make you dependent on them through making you dependent on their treatments, mostly in the form of pharmaceutical products. Psychiatrists deal with the mind and not the body, and as such the noblest of the medical doctor's role has been eliminated and the worst has been elevated. They also act as a form of control by prescribing analogues of methamphetamines to children and pharmacologically identical to ecstasy products to adults just to keep society functioning, in spite of the fact most mental anguish is caused by denial and rarely by delusions. But I won't continue on this tangent, as it is getting far too political, though my point stands that I have very little respect to the alternatives of MBTI, or, in the words of Ernest Rutherford, if your experiment needs statistics, you ought to have done a better experiment. Fourth of all, concerning the malleability of personality, I will deeply suggest looking up top 10 findings of behavioral genetics. It is, according to my opinion, and that of the Wikipedia editors on reproducibility within psychology, before it got silenced by rewarding that segment into cryptic jargon and making it shorter and less elaborated, the most vital, sound, and stably established part of psychology. I would propose these findings can now be held at the esteem of laws similarly to how we describe the process of physical phenotype, inheritance, or the inertia of moving bodies. That article says much, which may be summarized with little, but one of the most essential things it says is that while personality is certainly not immutable nor entirely genetic, the part of it that stays with one the majority of one's life and most deeply and intrinsically governs a person's temperament as different from that of the temperament of other people is indeed intrinsically, fundamentally, and profoundly genetic. As such, what you may describe as the self, ironically enough, a heavily Jungian concept, is actually in fact perhaps this very principle of something genetic bubbling up in spite of sometimes lifetime conditioning, something incredibly human, and yet fully something of which people are not as seldomly oblivious to. However, I do not wish to confuse Jung's concept of the shadow with that of the self, and as such I will abstain from further depiction of this construct. Fifth of all, the structure of personality is something that not only explains a great chunk of the phenomena presented as so-called counter-arguments, but in itself presents itself firstly the relative lack of difference amongst the populace, which the only real and Boolean binary difference of psychology, and perhaps all of humanity, ironically enough, originating in the distinction of the two sexes, and even more ironically enough, the structure of psychology itself, in your essay omitted, is by far the strongest, largest, and most conflictory counter-evidence against MBTI, Jung's personality types, and perhaps nearly every single ever possibly conceivable typology of human personality that wishes to distinguish humans in any other categories than that of either the sexes or the homogeneous average, and polarizingly and polary to each other its extremes, which in itself has a tenuous foundation considering the ill-definitional issue of marking the point of category difference within a continuous spectrum of traits. With these out of the way, let me now continue with your main thesis of the video, namely the low salience of MBTI as a model and its similarity of astrology, which you establish such as to devalue the prior. Essentially, a superstition is a means of accessing your own mind because it's inhibitory. Your mind isn't to stir up new ideas because otherwise it will just stick to mundane, regressive sobriety. When someone reads cards, and reads cards well, they don't actually believe the cards themselves have predictive power. They read them to get the ideas floating. If I tell you think of a 10-page essay on azure skies, you'd be dead silent, but I give you sufficient points to leap off of, then through association and with sufficient creativity, such as an exercise of including words cat, broom, and hot dog X amount of times, it will paradoxically make your task easier. Many forms of superstition persist until today for this function, and not because people genuinely externalize their decisions onto a deck of laminated paper. It's a form of exploiting cognitive priming. However, there is another somewhat related thing concerning this. The mind is analytical, especially the educated mind, and that can lead to cutting off the branches it's sitting on. You see, analysis, logic, etc. are in most scenarios bound by the paradigm. You start with the paradigm and depending on it derive a theory. But this is increasingly flawed the more prototypical a particular paradigm is, which, as I outlined prior, is most definitely the case for psychology. You cannot just measure a bunch of variables, correlate them, and then aim to intervene at the factors that correlate with adverse outcomes. That's a profoundly and ridiculously naive conceptualization of science. If anything, the intention is to first think rigorously, laboriously, and sensibly about the patterns that unite phenomena and then test these patterns out. Psychology actually has an incredible absence of a genuine inquiry on those, instead pumping from billions to trillions of dollars into half-baked experiments and shallow questionnaire studies. Additionally, superstitions also are a form of proto-ideas. Astrology is wrong in that there is a heavy mismatch between the zodiac sign and what actually happens to a person of that zodiac sign. But the actual real idea behind astrology was that the world is in a senselessly chaotic march forward to the ever daunting unpredictable future, but that the seasons and the stars repeat in pattern in cycle in a predictable manner, and this proto-idea is ironically one of the most potent to have ever been in human civilization. Saying it's wrong is like saying Thales of Miletus was wrong about the composition of matter. Well, duh. If they knew, they wouldn't have tried to make a guess. Also, in terms of the stars and human behavior, while it is far more of broad strokes, stars predict stage of the year, they predict season, and season of birth has been shown to be associated with particular temperamental differences. You can imagine, if you wish, MBTI as something akin to Aristotelian physics. It was wrong, fundamentally, and it had fundamental flaws, but it was a step in the right direction, and that the only way to improve upon that was to reconceptualize it into something better by going against the dogma with a more suitable generalization. MBTI is not a scientific model because we have absolutely no footing, grounding, or imagination concerning what the fuck to think about psychology. At best, we have insane people and cognitive psychology. Even neuroscience is misconstrued to such a ridiculous degree, it makes me quite skeptical of the insight of those that allow these degenerates to cause an influx of loud psychological and physiological noise, not just as a suggestion or some form of alternative treatment, but as something that sometimes happens to be mandatory. MBTI is like Aristotelian physics. We now know that force is acceleration, not a speed. Same way we know personality is Gaussian, not binary. But the structural and schematic representations are nearly the same to the actually correct models, except for a large step down in terms of fidelity and capacity to deal with oddball cases. The issue with MBTI and psychology lies in the fact nobody actually conducts science, read discovery, rather they learn the dogma they like in the span of 3 to 5 years and then proudly proclaim it until death without a shred of skeptical doubt. The reason I called MBTI a fringe niche interest, in spite of its widespread popularity, is because the community is markedly connected to discovery. It's highly speculative and innovative, always trying to wrestle this and that. The only real ideas kept are those that somehow personality structure can be sufficiently discretely divided up into 16 categories which relate to themselves in particular ways, hence the structure, and that the inception of the likeness of what those 16 categories could be like is inspired by the writings of a deeply curious Swiss psychoanalytic with particularly strong humanities and history background and with lifetime practice on insane patients. Anything else is fair game, because if something is wrong, then it ought to be corrected and reconceptualized into something correct. So long Carl Jung is not a buffoon that was so completely off, and so long that we can saliently split into 16, a 16 which must be somehow proven to be significantly this number, MBTI will trump other attempts at conceptualization of that which MBTI tries to figure out, since it is a far mightier force of inquiry and adaptable, ever-molding change.